I woke up and I wasn't sick, which was interesting because I really thought I was going to be. But feel okay. So not sure if I'm playing it today. I'll find out in a couple hours, uh, depending on how I feel. But until then, let's get on with the next section. This is the flop section, and this is as the preflop aggressor with a range advantage, and this is the example: Queen 10-5 monotone, all one suit. So let me turn the sound on. There we go.
Now let's discuss a tricky scenario when the board contains 3 cards of the same suit. So let's presume you raise under the gun +1, big blind calls, flop comes Queen 10-5, all spades. So now we're going to want to again categorize our hands based on premium made hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk. First, go through and categorize the premium made hands. That's going to be good top pairs and better. So here I've selected king, queen, and better. And notice here I've also selected the spades, right? So the ace high spades, this king high spades. And the way you do that in the range analyzer, just to be 100% sure you know how, say you wanted to select, I don't know, ace 7 of spades. You go down here, select the spade, and now we have ace 7 of spades, right? But notice these 3 other hands went somewhere else. They are in the not in range category, right? So we need to put these 3 combinations somewhere else. In this scenario, let's just presume we're going to put them in the junk category. So we'd put the number 3 right here. Notice if we wanted to select all of these, let's say. But now we have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18 hands that should be in the junk category, right? So that's how you'd want to use that feature. Notice here, I want to have ace of spades, king of spades as a premium hand too, though, right? But I don't. I have this as a blue cell because I'm using ace king as a draw. How do I do that? Well, notice I want to have hearts, clubs, and diamonds as a draw for ace king suited, right? You see 3 hands just went there. But I would like to have ace king of spades be a premium hand. Well, I need to add that here using a 1, right? Unless I want to have the same thing for ace jack, this would now become 2, right? So that's how you go about using that.
Super in-depth, complicated stuff. This is the kind of stuff that you'll pick a few like good archetype boards like he's done and work out these ranges. It takes a while, like, because Jonathan Little has most of this stuff that he's done hundreds of times, so he kind of knows this off the top of his head, so he can kind of just click through and all like that. But for the rest of us, you're going back to the charts, you're going back to the position, you're going back to the number of blinds and things like that. And, you know, we're averaging for a standard of 40 big blinds because that's kind of where you live in the tournament most of the time if you're doing okay. But just, you know, don't get frustrated. This is one where I will have a scenario every now and then that comes up that I'd say probably once a week. I think I write down 1 or 2 boards and textures once a week where it didn't really matter what happened in the hand. Either I won it or lost it or whatever, but I wasn't exactly sure what to do at a given point in the hand. This is kind of my next step after referring to charts and the flow decisions of raise, check, bet, call, things like that. Of like, if this, then that, you know, like if this is the board, then you bet this, then he does that, then you do this. Yeah, this stuff is amazing, but I just wanted to preface that this is very deep stuff. Don't think that you can understand it right away. I kind of say that for myself too, because I'm very math inclined and really fascinated by this stuff, but I have gotten to the point doing this specifically where I have gotten frustrated, walked away from the computer and been like, what the fuck are we even talking about? Because it's so deep. But then when you start learning how to, you know, properly use these tools and you realize, okay, well, I'm betting all these scenarios when I have these hands. So I'm betting every time, and you just want to understand the reason why you're betting, and the purpose for that is so that when you see a situation that is similar to this, not the same, not the exact scenario, but similar, you can then make your bets knowing what you're going to do next. Like if you're going to call a raise, or if you're going to check the turn, or if you're going to, you know, check raise, even if you don't make the hand and things like that. It kind of gives you a template for your next action. And when you look at it that way, then it becomes much more worth it to do this work away from the table. And like I said, all this is going to be on YouTube. You can rewatch these many times.
So we're betting all of our best hands here, our ace, king of spades, even though it's not selected, right? Betting all the flushes, etc. Marginal made hands. These are going to be middle pairs, really any other paired hand. We see pocket jacks, lots of tens, some queens, the under pairs, etc. And then our junk is relatively few combinations of hands. In this scenario, it's just the ace high that does not have a backdoor draw for the most part. All right, so taking a look at how this comes out, just naturally breaking it down, we see a 1-to-1 ratio, which implies a strong range advantage for me. Also, 30-11, which is more than the 70-30 ratio, which again implies solid range advantage for the initial raiser. So this is a spot where the under the gun +1 can get away with betting with his entire range. And if you take a look at this, it's what the solver does pretty much. Again, notice solver's betting or checking 12% of the time, which is a little bit, but certainly not enough to actually try to implement that. Like I said, in general, if the solver does something like 15% of the time or less, it's probably fine to just ignore it and push it into another category. So here I would just bet with everything. It is worth noting the solver opts to use a small bet size, 1/3 pot, the majority of the time. A lot of people think on these monotone boards that your goal is to protect your hand so you don't get outdrawn by a random spade in your opponent's hand. The thing is, though, is that if you think about the hands in your range that have random spades, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, right? They're all very, very good spades. And so you're not really so concerned with protection with your entire range on average. So solver does use a small size here, and that's what I'd recommend as well. Now let's go to the next level and talk about button versus big blind on queen 10-5 all spades. This is going to be a pretty complicated range analyzer image, but we're going to take it slow and we're going to figure this out together. All right, let's categorize the best made hands first. Best made hands are usually going to be top pair good kickers and better, so that's going to be queen jack and better hands. Notice here, though, that we have all of these hands containing a spade.
Understand what he said there. Good kicker, queen jack, right? Like people would think queen jack isn't really that great on this board, but you have to understand every time you have a card in your hand, the other guy doesn't. So for me, queen jack is fine. You know what I'm saying? Like, granted, if you get a lot of, an excessive amount of action, you kind of have to watch it. And maybe you pot control on the turn of the river, like where, you bet the flop, you get called, you bet the turn, you get called. And then the heart, the spade didn't come off. Those are good situations where you can check and then allow your opponent to bluff at you. And then, you do have a value hand, but if you get called 3 times, like let's say the board is, queen 10-5 all spades, you have queen jack with the jack of spades in your hand, right? And and you bet the flop for like a 3rd pot. You're playing against one player in position, out of position. Because you raised an early position, this is under the gun +1. So let's say the hijack called you. So you bet the flop for a 3rd pot, he calls. The turn comes off. It's like a 4 of clubs, whatever. You bet the turn for like, 2/3 pot, maybe a little less, and he calls. And the river comes off, I don't know, like a deuce of, hearts, whatever. Just a total, nothing run out, right? If you bet there on that river, even small, and get called, you're probably beat. But can king queen bet if you check? Probably not. And king queen is fairly premium in this scenario. King queen can't really bet. Honestly, some players won't even bet the ace queen unless they have the ace of spades, and then at that point they would have raised you before then. So the hands that beat you aren't going to bet. Queen king, even some 2 pairs will elect to not bet. Like if a guy had, the 5-4 on the flop and just took a card off and then made 2 pair on the turn. A lot of players aren't going to bet that just because it's so weak. And there's also, some people who aren't going to bet hands like, nobody's going to bet, king 10 or ace 10 with the ace of spades. They're just going to take the showdown. But if you check, they're not betting those hands that beat you, but they are going to bluff at you at a very high frequency. You're giving them an opportunity. You're saying, I raised pre-flop, I had something. I bet on the flop, I have something. I bet on the turn, I have something. A lot of people see the check on the river as, maybe this guy's got me beat. I don't think that way, because if he had me beat, he would have told me by now. The reason for me to check this river is to get that last street of value when my opponent should never really have me beat. I mean, there are random times where I'm being trapped, sure, but you're going to be able to tell, and before you get to the river, they're going to make some form of action that's going to let you know, either a timing tell or a raise. So checking in that instance, you're going to see a bet from any spade draw. You know, the ace of spades is always going to bet. You know, a 10 is going to bet. Anything that turns its hand into a draw into a bluff. You know, king jack, jack nine. All these hands will absolutely bet the river, trying to get you to fold what you have, a one pair hand. And those are great spots to pick up extra value. And you know, but think about it. If you'd made the same bet that you're going to call, and the guy calls you, you're beat. But if you check and he bets and you call, you're going to win a very high percentage of the time. I know it sounds weird, but it makes sense when you think about it in those terms.
But none of them are selected. Notice here that some of these hands are played as draws and some of them are played as junk, right? Like, for example, we're calling ace of spades blank, or ace of spades nine, nine of spades is a premium hand, but ace of spades nine of hearts is junk here. We're using these other hands as draws. Take it slow, we're not to the draws yet. What you could do if you wanted to just go ahead and set these as a placeholder is to just go ahead and select them as spades by going through here and, you know, selecting all of these as spades, right? That's a nice way to go through and immediately select them. And then what you can do is you can go through and put in your hands in green, the marginal made hands. This is going to be basically any pair. And now we want to try to start looking for our draws. Okay. You will have all of the spades selected. Notice we have all these king high spades, etc., etc. All these will be selected. This is 17% of hands. We need to find about 35, 34, 36% draws such that we have as many draws as possible. So the most obvious draws to select here are going to be the gut shot straight draws, the open-ended straight draws, but then it's actually kind of hard to find more spades. So you're going to want to add in ace of spades blank, like ace of spades 5, and also perhaps blank with an ace. Let me show you how you would go about doing that. Let's say I wanted to select ace of spades with any other side card. What you do, if I want to put that in the draw, let's say I wanted to select ace of spades with any 9. I would select right here. Notice 3 hands just got selected. But what happened to the other 9? These down here. All of these got moved to the not in range category, but we want them to be junk, so we put a 9 right here. Let's say instead I wanted ace of spades with a 9, or a 9 with an ace of spades, a 9 of spades with an ace. You would now select this, so there would be 6 hands that go here, and now there are 6 hands that would get moved to the junk. So let's say you wanted to select all of these that have any one spade. Select like this. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
This is what you would do if you were playing somebody heads up. Like, not meaning you raised and it's a 9-handed table and they called, meaning you're heads up at the start of the deal. And then, because any spade here on this board has big equity, because when you have a spade, there's one less for the other guy to have, and obviously it depends on the height of your spade, but playing heads up with the 9 high flush, you know, on a one-liner can be a really powerful spot to bet and then bluff catch. I've won a lot of tournaments with a one-liner flush. You know, and it wasn't even a good one. It was just like, it just made sense to catch somebody with the 9 or 8 of spades when they just pounded the board in trying to represent, and it just didn't make sense because they're never going to have you know, the ace of spades when they're making that bet. So just an interesting thing. That's when you would do this more likely, but this is good to know for full ring.
6, 7, 8. 8 times 6, because that's how many hands are not selected, is 48. So this number would become 48. Okay? I know we may be going through this a little bit fast. Make sure you watch the instructions on the range analyzer because we discussed this type of thing there. We need to come up with about 35% draws. In this scenario, it is hard to find draws. You usually are going to want to use hands that have some equity, like the spades, which I've already done, right? Notice here that's what all of these hands over here are. And then we're also just going to want to use some very low equity bluffs. And that's going to be stuff like, well, ace 7 for ace high and worse. Maybe you could check ace highs if you felt like it. I don't think that would be too terrible. That'd give you a little bit too much junk, but it would give you perhaps the right ratio of draws. I think that is fine. And then you have all of your other junk And if you take a look at these ratios, once we go through here and categorize the hands, we have about a 2-to-1 ratio draws to premium made hands, and we have about a 70-30 ratio marginal made to junk. I realize we're a bit heavy on draws in this scenario, but that's fine. And in this situation, whenever you see these ratios line up just like this, it implies we cannot bet with everything. We must check with our marginal made hands and our junk in this scenario. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. Remember, before we had too many premium made hands and draw, our marginal made hands for the most part, and that led to us betting very frequently. But now we don't. That's going to lead to us checking right at these percentages where we're checking the marginal made hands and the junk. Looking at the solver, that's actually what the solver does. Notice that I was checking 45% of the time. The solver opts to check 41% of the time, so we're pretty close there. You'll notice the solver's checking a lot of the marginal made hands. Notice betting a lot of these random ace of spades type hands, right? And king of spades type hands, with the other sidecar being a spade as well. Sometimes, like, king of spades, 9 of diamonds, or king of diamonds, 9 of spades. So that is nice to see. And our ratios line up pretty nicely. And if you went through and broke down how the solver is playing all these exact hands, it'd probably line up pretty close to what we were doing. It is good to see the solver betting stuff like 8-6. You see it's betting it like 75% of the times, which implies it's doing it with stuff like 8-6 of hearts, right? Which is a very, very low equity bluff. And that is good to see. Notice it's betting like ace high, bad ace highs, right? It's betting bad ace highs pretty much all the time, or very close to all the time. And that's good to see. So it's betting ace 4 of diamonds on this flop, right? And if you take a look at how I had this categorized, we had ace 4 of diamonds betting. And again, I know the solver is using a very, very mixed strategy here that's impossible for us humans to implement, but you'll see it's mostly betting the best made hands, like take a look, ace queen, king queen, queen jack, right? These hands are betting very frequently. The weaker queens check more often than they bet, right? The 10s do a lot of checking. The 5s do a lot of checking, right? So you see that we're playing pretty much like the solver's doing. Not perfectly, but pretty close, and that is what we are aiming for. This is about as complicated as it's going to get, by the way. So if you can figure out this one, we're going to be good to go.
The thing about this is you're going to end up saying, why does all this, even matter? And it's because it allows you to narrow your opponent's range when they respond to the actions you give. But more importantly, this really is that, it's like that goofy thing you used to hear in school, knowledge is power or whatever like that. In poker, it really is, because if you have a better understanding of this, you'll literally, and watching Jonathan Little when he does, live plays and he's playing tournaments, he's so automatic, it's hilarious. Like, to the point where I think he's actually moving too quickly because the other players are sitting there thinking he's just, like, has these automatic moves which don't mean anything. But the truth of the matter is he has reasons behind them, and he actually knows the percentages and stuff like that. Now, to be fair, the guy's playing 16 tables at once. It's fucking bananas. That's all tournaments at $100 buy-ins and higher. It's crazy to watch, but really fascinating. And, it makes a lot of money very quickly because he's able to implement such volume at such precision. But at the same time, all this stuff just kind of feeds into your ability to always pull the trigger. And if you can always pull the trigger and bet when you're supposed to bet, then you're going to do very well. And it's very hard to get to that point, but this is how you build up that knowledge to be able to do it, because then you're not even bluffing. Like, you can sit there on this queen 10-5 board, and it's very easy to bet the ace of spades in your hand, right? Because you're not bluffing. You have all the equity. But when you bet and don't get raised, you can also continue betting things like, the 10 of clubs with the king of spades in your hand, or the jack of spades in your hand, and, for value and for protection. You can still get, you don't have to blast these pots out and make people just fold, because they're going to be calling you improperly. So it's a really interesting way to look at it, and it just means every bet you're making becomes a form of value bet because it adds value to your stack, All
right, let's take a look at one more spot. Under the gun +1 versus button on queen 10-5 all spades. Categorize the hands again. Notice that we do need to do a little bit more slow playing out of position, so we check the aces in this scenario. Notice, though, that we do still have pretty reasonable ratios here. We have a 70-30 30 ratio. Maybe we have a little bit too much junk here, so maybe we need to bluff a little bit more often. We could use a few more draws. Notice if I was remaking this range analyzer image right now, I'd probably take a little bit of junk and add it to the draw category, just because we want to make our marginal mated range a little bit stronger. So we probably just, I'm sure I bet with all the obvious draws already, like all the gut shots, etc. So we're just going to take low equity bluffs, like probably king 8 offsuit or ace 2 offsuit, something like that. Well, ace 2 of hearts, right? And probably bluff those if I had to guess. But notice everything else is outlined very nicely. It is worth mentioning that we must proceed cautiously here because the button has a lot of ace of spades, x of spades in their range, right? It's also worth noting that we should consider checking some premium made hands that don't really mind protection. I would not be shocked if we should check some nut flushes in this scenario. And perhaps that's what I did in the analyzer. Maybe I'm checking some of these hands. So instead of like ace, jack of spades being a premium hand, maybe we actually have it selected as a marginal hand that we are checking and then not folding. So you want to make sure your checking range is decently protected in this spot. And if you look at the solver, solver actually does check some suited aces. Or, ace of spades, 8 of spades. How can I tell? Because it has 25% of this range is ace of spades, 8 of spades, but it's only betting it like, 12% of the time or something. Same thing for these, right? So the solver opts to check some of these hands that are the effective nuts some portion of the time. Not all the time, but sometimes. And notice solver checks here a total of 60% of the time, quite a bit. And that's because it doesn't really have a huge nut advantage. It has some nut advantage, but not a huge nut.
Because your only nut advantage coming out of an early position is having the suited ace of spades. Or having, the king of spades suited, things like that. Like, you basically have to have a flopped flush here to have the nut advantage because, even with a set, you're vulnerable. So the button is going to have more of those in his range. He's going to have more hands like 9-8 suited. You know what I'm saying? Or Jack King suited or whatever like that. Hands that effectively have you crushed unless you have the absolute nuts. So that's why out of position, you're going to be checking more. Kind of just a general rule. Out of position, no matter what the scenario, you're going to be checking more. Doesn't always mean the majority of the time, but it does mean if you had this hand on this flop with this action where you raised and somebody called, or you called and somebody raised, whatever, in position, you're going to be betting more. Out of position, you're checking more. You just have to.
Nut advantage. Notice here I was checking 30, 40, 50-ish% of the time, so a little bit less than the solver, but still within the realm of reason, right? And that's going to result in us playing decently well. Let's take a look at some of the checking hands real quick. The 10s check a lot. We have these underpairs checking a lot. I'm actually betting in these scenarios, I think, with the lower spades, which gives us a little bit more draws. So anyway, as you can see, solver does bet these lower pairs some portion of the time, not a ton. Solver checks a lot of 10s, checks a lot of the weaker queens. So again, strategy lines up pretty nicely with the solver, and that means we're going to be playing the spot reasonably well. This monotone board is a very, very tough spot to play unless you studied it away from the table, but now we spent a little bit of time studying it, so you should be able to navigate this spot way better than perhaps you would before you watched this video.
That's why we study. You are under the gun +1 versus the big blind. You should be betting frequently or infrequently on this queen 10-5 suited. Well, he's out of position. You should be betting frequently. All right. You have the range advantage. You also have position. You're out of position as the preflop raiser. So you raised and then somebody behind you called. Should you bet with a small or large size on this bet, on this flop? Typically it's a small size just because we are out of position acting first. If we are going to bet, most of our bets are going to be small because our range advantage is there, or our nut advantage is low, but our range advantage is high. So, right, due to the large non-nut advantage, it's going to be easier for other players to have more suited combinations than us when we're the original opener, because the original opener has more unpaired big cards, ace king, ace queen, pairs, things like that. The good stuff that everybody looks down at and goes, oh yeah, you know what I'm saying? But, other than hands like, the suited varieties of that, you're not going to have too many suited connectors from earlier positions. I mean, hands like, 9, 10, and 10 jack, sure. But everything else that's suited is going to be big cards. So But a guy with 5-6 suited can call you on the button all day long. You know what I'm saying? At 40 big blinds and just flop you dead. You know what I'm saying? So the betting should be small, and then you have to kind of go from there. When you're on the button facing the big blind, would it be significant loss of EV to c-bet your entire range on this board? I don't think so. Now, we are betting small, but we're in position. He's checked to us. I don't think it would be. Oh, you should be betting roughly 60% of the time, but you don't have a large enough range nut advantage to bet your entire range. Oh, okay, I see what it's saying. Oh, wait. Button versus big blind. I had it backwards. Big blind versus button. I had it backwards. Sorry. So that makes sense. So yeah, because you're going to have a slight range advantage, but not so much a nut advantage. But even then, your opponent does have a good range advantage because people defend the blinds with big cards, broadways. So there's 2 of them on the board. So yeah, I guess you don't have the range advantage at all, really. So good spot to check a good portion of the time. And yeah, 60-40 sounds about right. You're on the button facing the big blind with 9-9, heart and diamond, on this board. Should you c-bet or check back? See, to me, and maybe this is overthinking, I might be missing the point of the last question. See, I think if you check this one, you really don't even have a bluff catcher. So I think c-betting is okay. It's not great. It's not every time. It kind of depends who I'm playing against. But I think c-betting is okay because if we check back, he's going to bet all turns, and that gives us nothing. But if we c-bet, he may just fold trash. And we have one of our worst hands in this scenario, so when you have your worst hands, you usually want to bet more, because to make it worth it for the times that, you make nothing with them. So, no. Okay, we're just going with marginal made hand. All right. I'm thinking about it in tournament dynamics, but it is a marginal made hand. It's one pair. Checking back is fine. He's right. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I overthought it. And that is just a basic general answer. So now this is the 40 big blind range advantage example with a board of jack of spades, 6 of clubs, deuce of diamonds. Low unconnected rainbow flop.
Now let's discuss a very uncoordinated flop. Jack 6-2. So you raise under the gun +1. Big blind calls. Flop comes Jack 6-2. This is a scenario where I can already tell you we're going to have a big range advantage, right? Because if you think about it, we're raising with mostly good hands. Our opponent's calling with mostly bad hands in the big blind. And this board is very much uncoordinated. So we're going to have lots of reasonably high equity hands in this scenario. Going through and categorizing our hands, probably Jack 10 or better is a strong value hand. Worse made hands are marginal. Notice we have Ace King and Ace Queen listed as a marginal hand here. And that's because if I did happen to check this, I would definitely call a turn bet with it on virtually every turn because these hands are often best. And if they're not the best, they usually have 6 clean outs to a good hand, right? So
it's a very common move that you'll see me play every day where I've raised and the big blind has defended. The flop comes off something trashy like this. He checks and I have Ace King and I'm just like, I can just check back here because the Ace King has enough showdown value. And it happens every day where I check it. The turn comes off, no real significance to the board. And the player bets, and I call it because, again, I still have good showdown value. And then the river comes off, and they check, and I check back, and I show the ace king, and the person rolls over nothing. They were going to roll over, queen high or some weird gut shot draw that just took a shot. You know what I'm saying? Happens a lot on rainbow boards when you go check, and, the turn comes off and puts up another suit. So, let's somebody had the 3-4 of diamonds, and the turn comes off, the 8 of diamonds. Now they have a gut shot, they have a flush draw, so they're going to take a shot with their equity, but then you call them, and the river comes off, the 10 of clubs. They're just like, jigs up, and they just check. You know what I'm saying? And also another point that he made is that the Jack 10 is a, is a betting hand that you're betting because it's a premium, because top pair on this board is probably best the vast majority of the time when you're under the gun and the big blind defended, because all the good jacks, ace jack, pocket queens, kings, aces, all sets, things like that. When you bet, hey, DeBaus, what's up, my man? Appreciate that. Finally got the subscription out of you, man. Much, much, much appreciated. Those subscriptions really do lift my mood and keep me going. I appreciate that, man. It's never the goal, but it's always awesome. So thank you so much. And that's the thing. So like, betting hands like Jack 10 here, it's important to do. And again, we're in that scenario where we're going to bet, and then we're going to bet the turn, and then the river, they may, or we may check the turn, and then the river that can induce a bluff. You know what I'm saying? Like, we can get 2 streets with Jack 10 and be comfortable. Just waiting for it to expire. Oh, yeah, right. The Prime. Oh, that's right. It was the Prime sub. Appreciate it, my man. Yeah, those Prime subs are great. I always forget to use mine. I got to remember to do that. The first of the month, I always pick a Prime sub. So that's basically interesting. So don't be afraid to bet those marginal made hands, like the Jack 10s and the ace 6s and stuff. Like if you raise with ace 6 suited under the gun +1, which is reasonable at certain points of the tournament, not too great, but you could bet the ace 6, sure. You could even bet hands like 6-7 suited here, for sure. You could basically bet any pair, really. I would even bet, pairs in my hand, 9s, 8s, why not? It's the same deal. Like, you have to kind of proceed with caution once you're played with, but I've had it happen hundreds of times where you just bet with pocket 8s here, somebody calls you, goes check, check, turn, they bet the river, you call them, and they just show you a draw. And it's just, it's kind of the way it goes. So don't discount your hand. The most common thing you see is where players raise under the gun or under the gun +1 with pocket kings or queens, and an ace hits the flop, and they just give up. They're just like, well, that's an ace. And it's like, really? Because you didn't get 3-bet pre-flop. You're facing the big blind. Why are you not betting? Like, for what reason? Because you see an ace? That's like saying I'm not gonna drive my car because I once saw an accident. That's stupid. You have to go by the information you have and go from there. Obviously it's not worth 3 streets, but it could be worth 2.
These are marginal hands in this scenario. Sometimes ace high is marginal, sometimes it's not. And then I have even like ace 10 listed as marginal for the same reason. And here we have a lot of other ace X's, which I also have listed as marginal if they do not have a backdoor flush draw. I listed all the backdoor flush draws here as draws because, again, we need to try to find some draws. But this range is so good to the point that even using literally every backdoor flush draw, I don't have anywhere near enough draws. So this is a spot where we have a big range and nut advantage. As you see, solver bets very, very frequently, which makes a lot of logical sense. All right, let's take a look at button versus.
It didn't show it for too long, but it bet very frequently, betting 2/3 of the pot about 1/3 of the time, and betting 1/3 of the pot about 2/3 of the time. So the majority of the time when that flop hits and you have that huge range advantage, just bet small. 2 out of 3 bet small, and you can kind of adjust depending on the player. Like some players will just call if the bet's not too expensive and you have to bluff again if you are bluffing. So in those scenarios, it kind of makes sense to bet bigger. You know what I'm saying? Like, because they're going to be like, fuck it, and they'll just give it up. You know what I'm saying? With this, backdoor or whatever draw, they'll just throw it away, and then you don't have to expose yourself. It's also a good way to set up a bet when you are betting small versus an unknown player. You can bet 1/3 on the pot on the flop. You're going to bet 2/3 on the turn, and you're probably going to jam river. That's the bet strategy, and very, very reasonable to do that on flops like this when you have the range advantage, because you could just have aces, right? If the board runs out, like this, and then like a 4 on the turn, and then like, I don't know, a queen on the river or something like that, or maybe not a queen, maybe like another 4, whatever. If it just runs out innocuous like that, you can just have aces and have no reason to not jam the chips in. That's the concept of the bet. It's like, okay, nothing really there, I bet. Guy calls, okay, nothing really there, I bet. He calls, okay, nothing really there, he checks, I jam, and he folds. And that's just the way you would do it with aces. And the reason why you're jamming the river when you have ace high in this scenario is because you don't want to get beat by one shitty pair. Like, let's say somebody has 5-6 here, right? And they called you on the flop, and then the turn was a 4. Now they have a gut shot. They can hit a 5. They can hit a 6 to make a good hand. So they call the turn. And then the river comes off, and it's another deuce, right? If they check there and you check back with ace high, it's a fucking disaster because they are never calling you. Never calling you with second pair when you go bet, bet, bet. Because you are representing at least top pair, if not an over pair, right? They were looking to make a strong hand to be able to call you. When they miss, they check. And you'd be surprised how many times people make the one-liner straight and just jam the chips in at you. And you just go, guess this bluff isn't working. And you just fold. Like, people aren't smart enough to check back at the lower levels. Honestly, I would say at the $100 level, they're not, or up until the $100 level, $100 tournament buy-ins, they're not smart enough to check the river when they make the nut. The conceivable nuts. The amount of times I've seen this go where I've gone bet, 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 or I was planning to, and the board paired the second card on the river, like a 6, and the player just jammed all their chips into me, and I just folded. I've actually done it where I've folded and shown live that I was like, I didn't have anything, whatever. You'd be amazed how many times people will go, yeah, I knew you didn't have anything, and then they show you the 5-6. It's like, okay, you didn't know I didn't have anything. You got bailed out, bro. And then you wasted your hand by, jamming all the chips in when my intention was to bluff completely at them. Like, it's the worst mistake you'll ever see. So understand that's what you're up against, and that's why you want to bet the river when nothing reasonable has happened yet, and the player checks to you. So that's the third bet and bet.
Big blind. Are we in that same scenario? Well, maybe we are, maybe we aren't. Let's go through and categorize the hands. Notice that I have most good jacks and better value betting. We have all of the pairs and ace highs listed as marginal. The lower pairs listed as marginal. Up to slow play to pocket jacks. I think that's fine. You don't have to slow play. Slow playing top set is sometimes fine, and I don't have a problem with it one way or the other. Solver seems to slow play seemingly randomly, but I'm sure it has some logic behind it. Then I'm betting basically any cards that have overcards to the jack that also have an overcard to the 6, like Queen 7, for example, right? We're using that as a draw. We're using all of these backdoor flush draws as draws. And as you see, we have to search kind of hard to find anywhere near enough draws in this scenario. We can have up to 36% draws. We can't really find it. Notice that we also have more premium made hands compared to junk than necessary. So again, that's going to indicate the fact that we're going to have a solid range advantage in this scenario. Let's, however, see what the solver does. Solver notes that we don't have a huge range advantage, but we have some, and therefore it elects to check 22% of the time. I can tell you, in practice, you're just going to want to bet this flop pretty much every single time, and the reason is because the vast majority of players out of position in this scenario are not going to check raise you nearly often enough. Like, if you give most players the 10-9 of spades, they're just going to check fold, but in reality, they probably should be check raising a decent amount of the time, and that would put you in a tough scenario. But most people just check call and then check fold a lot on the turn. So this is a spot where I would generally recommend you deviating from the solver a little bit and betting every time instead of only 78% of the time. 78% of the time is still quite a bit. All right, now we have the scenario again where we're out of position. Here we raise under the gun plus.
If you watched the cash game stream last night, and you can see it on YouTube, I actually uploaded it on both my YouTube channels just to kind of advertise on the secondary one that people know. But it was a 10-L session on WSOP. I was check raising top pair on the flop a ton out of position. And that's because of exactly what he just said. Most people don't do it enough. So if most people don't do it enough and you do it too much, you're going to come out on the better end of it. But I was doing things like, on a board like this, a player in the, low jack would raise, and then the cutoff would call, and the button would call. And this is very common in cash games where you'll see that. And I'm in the small blind with, jack 9 suited, or something like that. And, or the big blind usually. And I call flop comes off like this, and I'm facing 4 or 5 players. I just check. The original raiser bets, right? Somebody calls, and then I check raise, and I mean check raising big, like, going full pot when the check raise. And then the original raiser folds 99% of the time, and the other player, believe it or not, last night, and it was happening last night a ton, you can actually see lots of examples of it, called the turn, or called the flop, the turn comes off nothing, and then I just ripped it. And about 50% of the time they folded, and 50% of the time they called me with worse. And it's like, how do they have worse on this board? Pocket nines. It's amazing. It's amazing. There was no draw for me to have, and no reason for me to be betting so heavily unless I had a good hand. But I literally piled 60 blinds into a 40 big blind, or into a 80 big blind pot, and they have 60 blinds effective behind, and would call it off with pocket nines here, drawing to 2 outs. It's hilarious. I definitely check there more than I should. Well, you want to check, but you definitely want to check raise. You know what I'm saying? We're talking about, under the gun +1 versus the button. So you're now out of position, right? So if you had the Jack 9 here, you could check, the button had raised, or the button had called you pre-flop, and then they bet, and then you check raise. You know what I'm saying? Or let's say you raised under the gun, and you did have a hand like King Jack suited, right? Or something like that. And then the button 3-bet you. Okay, cool. The button's 3-betting range is wider than top pair here. So he's going to have way more hands like ace queen, king queen. He's going to have the Jack 10s, believe it or not. He's going to have all the pairs, 9s and lower, down to like 5s. He's going to have all that shit. So when he c-bets, you're really just basically saying, do you have an overpair or not? So then you can just check the flop here because you've made a good top pair, but you don't have the leading range anymore. And then the button c-bets, usually a third in this scenario in tournaments, and then you check raise. And then you just watch their brain melt. And people just go, wait a minute, this guy raised, called my 3-bet, check, raised me. What the fuck is going on? Like, the amount of times I've done that in live tournaments and cash games and played that exact same move and had somebody with a very minimal understanding of how poker works look at me and go, flopped a set of jacks, huh? And then fold aces. Or call me and then call the all-in on the turn with pocket nines again. It's hilarious. Like, it's one of those bets that's evergreen because a lot of times you're going to get folds from better and calls from worse. And you just have to look ridiculous. When you see the call, and yeah, you're going to get trapped sometimes, but then you're up against a 5% hand, so it's very rare. And especially when you have like a king in your hand, like the king jack, because you now remove some possibility of him having kings, right, as the overpair.
+1 and the button calls. Flop comes Jack 6-2. This is a board that should connect decently well with the button calling range, right? Because they're going to be calling a lot of good, strong, big cards. A lot of those contain a jack. So we have to be somewhat selective when it comes to betting. Notice in this scenario, if I go through and categorize the hands again, we end up with a marginal made range that is pretty strong.
Right. I want to hammer that home. You're checking and calling the king jack there rather than raising. You always want to ask yourself why. If you don't know what to do, this is the best advice I can give you to boss. New players, when they don't know what to do, they call because they think the worst thing in the world is getting bluffed. It's not. The worst thing in the world is losing. Okay, losing more money than you should. So if you don't know what to do, a good player will fold, right? A new player will call and then be forced to fold on a later street. A good player will fold saying, I don't know what's going on. Fuck this noise. I'm folding before I throw money away, right? Because they're just too confused. That's a very good play, and you're going to be in that position for a very long time. When you get to a higher level, a little more educated level, a lot more educated level after a few years of experience, a lot of times when you don't know what to do, you're going to raise. Because you're going to logic out what's going on and go, based on the range, I should be able to get a bluff through here quite often. So check raising or on the bluff or check raising for value makes a lot more sense. But you have to have hundreds of hours of play in and, hundreds of hours of study. So don't worry about getting to that level, but just keep it in the back of your mind that it's an option, that if you don't know what to do, making the other guy make a decision is usually a good idea. Don't let him take over the pot.
Can very confidently check call, and a junk range that can reasonably check fold. Notice before I said that ace 10 offsuit, if we go back to the previous scenario where we were in position, I had ace 10 offsuit listed as a marginal hand. That's because if I let it go check check in position, I can easily call a turn bet. Here though, from out of position, I don't think we can realistically check call flop, or if we do check call flop, we certainly can't check call turn. So we do need to perhaps adjust our range a little bit when we go from in position to out of position. Your marginal made hands in position, when you're out of position, those hands are going to become a little bit weaker. So the weakest marginal made hands are going to become junk, which is why we have like these ace highs that may be able to call in position become junk out of position. So that's what we're doing in this scenario. We are going to be doing a decent amount of checking, 46%. And it turns out solver also does a decent amount of checking. Notice when it does bet, it's betting using a bigger size, because when it is betting, it usually has a pretty strong range.
This is also the thing where you see me go all the time where I don't have anything and I just have like ace king on this board, but I have the leading range. Betting bigger here on the flop makes a bigger statement, because it says I have an overpair that I'm protecting, right? Even though there's nothing to protect against, there's no draw out here. It's saying, okay, I have a good hand. I still have a good hand. This board didn't affect me. It's more believable to bet 2/3 pot, maybe a little less, that you have something on this board when you have the range advantage, than it is betting 1/3 of the pot. See, the board here, like if you have ace king on this board, you're going to get a lot more success betting 2/3 of the pot or checking than you are betting 1/3, because it's so easy to call. If you check, you're preserving your hand's showdown value with that ace king, right? But if you decide to bluff, you're going to bet bigger because it's less risk. I can say I fold more than I did before and don't trap myself by committing to a bad hand. Huge lesson to learn. Huge lesson to learn. When I started playing poker, especially seriously live, I would look for spots to fold more than anything else. Now, this is back in 2005, so it was a much different game. But at the same time, I would be so proud of myself when I had like 3-bet pre-flop with something good, gotten the worst flop ever, and then the other player leads into me, and I would just fold it. Just be like, well, not my board. You know what I'm saying? It's absolutely hilarious how often you see players just be like, well, I did this pre-flop, so I have to keep going. No, you don't. No, you don't. You can control the game completely by deciding how you continue. That's the thing that once you take that concept to heart and realize that you actually have a lot more control than anybody else, because nobody can make you do anything. You know what I'm saying? You can make all the decisions. You can fold and nobody will ever know what you folded, unless you stream it. But you can have reasons for that, but nobody will ever know. So what are you embarrassed about? Right? Like, that's the thing. People get embarrassed. I say it all the time. There's people who make e-calls, embarrassment calls, because, they've made some stance on the flop and then you've check raised them and then you see them call a lot. And that's why I bet big on the turn, because they just think it's bullshit and they're trying to hero me. You know what I'm saying? So they just get embarrassment calls. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, realizing that had saved me a lot of chips. It will. It will save you a ton over your career.
And, that's going to have the button caller in pretty bad shape. Like, notice ace, jack, aces, kings, queens, etc. So this is a spot where you cannot bet every time, and you certainly do need to check. Notice the hands that often check are going to be a lot of ace high type hands, a lot of
hands with showdown value, but weak showdown value, ace highs.
Jacks are still checking some portion of the time. Again, very mixed strategy out of the solver, which you'll always see when you're out of position, which is why it's kind of difficult to implement. But doing something like this makes a lot of logical sense, right? You're betting your best hands, betting your draws, and checking the marginal hands and junk. And this is going to be a pretty strong strategy that's going to work well against basically everyone. I will say, though, if you wanted to exploit your opponents, let's say you know the player on the button calls a lot pre-flop but then folds too often on the flop, this may just be a scenario where you should be betting with everything, because your opponent's range connectivity is going to be so bad.
Yep.
Because a lot of people are going to be sitting here with hands like King 10, or 9-8 suited, and they're just going to fold to a bet. And if you can make your opponents fold those hands to one bet on the flop, then you might as well blast it. I'm sure if you ran this through the solver and you said the opponent folds too often, the solver would recommend instead of betting, how much is it betting again? Instead of betting, call it 64% of the time, it would probably say bet 100%. So on these uncoordinated boards, it's kind of hard to be too aggressive unless your opponent is going to fight fire with fire by raising your bets very frequently, which most people don't do.
It's the moments when the river comes out and I look at my hand and thinking, why am I even still here? Okay, here's the thing. I don't play chess, but I've read a lot of chess books because they're tied into game theory. So the strategy of chess, I've adapted to a lot of things. I don't play chess very well at all. Like, it's just, with the way my brain works with the dyslexia, it just doesn't piece together very well. But I have learned a lot about chess theory and applied it to poker because it's essentially the same, the concept of thinking ahead. You want to have your brain eventually, automatically, and this is why you saw me playing yesterday and you were like, I don't get how you can play all these tables. It's because I'm sitting there going, if this, then that. So if I bet the flop, then this player calls. Then on the turn, I'm going to do this. Then if he does that, I'm going to do this. If he does something else, I'm going to do that. And then if we get to the river and I do this and he does that, I'm going to do this. But if I do this and he does that, I'm going to do something else. So you're really thinking out that decision tree ahead of time. So you never get to the river and go, why the fuck am I still here? You're going to look at those cards on the river and go, this sucks. But I'm here because I got the proper odds to draw to this hand versus this fish who will pay me off every time I make my draw. But now it's time to fold. And you just fold it. Or now it's time to turn my hand into a bluff. And you decide to bluff it. You know what I'm saying? Because you realize through your actions, your player has incomplete information, or your opponent has incomplete information. You can then manipulate the situation. No one knows for sure what you have unless they see your cards. That is the general theory. Now, once you get more experienced, I was doing it. That stream last night, you should really watch it on YouTube, the 10&L stream. I just uploaded it last night. It was a ton of examples of me going, this player has exactly this hand. I have no doubt this player has exactly this hand, so therefore I'm going to pile all the money in. And while the time was ticking, there was a few of these where I had bet like 120 blinds into a 40 big blind pot. And I said, and with the nuts, and I said, this player has exactly this hand. It's super weak. They shouldn't even be here on the turn, but they are. And now with this large bet, I have convinced them that I am utterly and completely full of shit and getting called by second and third pair when I had top set. They're just drawing dead. And it's like, you have to understand what your bets do to the other opponent's brain, and it just puts them in a pretzel. And when you're playing against bad players, which on WSOP, I'm playing against bad players. Up to 100 NL, they're bad players. That's all there is to it. They're not studying, they're not reading, they're not looking. They're not trying to learn. These are guys who've been playing the same way for decades. And they will for the rest of their life. And they'll tell you they're a break-even player, which is a lie. We know that's a lie. And they just call because they have to see it. But even then, I've done that where I've made the call. Like, I've done it on stream where I've said, you know what, I'm not going to sleep right if I don't see this one. I think this guy has this, but I have to see it. And I've called it, been right or been wrong. And when I'm wrong, I've won the pot. And when I'm right, it's like, okay, confirmed. I've learned something about this player and about this situation. And I can take that to the next time. So when it comes up again, I don't make the same mistake. Sometimes you're paying for the lesson. You know what I'm saying? Like, years ago, there was a saying going around playing live where people would say, you're going to school. When you play 1-2, you go to school because you're supposed to be there to learn, because the theory was you couldn't make a living playing 1-2 because the rake was too high. That is utter and complete trash. If you play better poker than the field, you can make a living. I did make a living for over 2 years playing live 1-2 exclusively. I had a couple of tournaments in there, but really only one significant win. And ironically, all that money got eaten up by car trouble that my roommate had, at the time. And we needed to move, and it was a whole thing. So my giant score got taken like that, like within a month. And it would have changed the dynamic of my poker career if I hadn't had like $8,000 in extra bills in a month. It was crazy. But luckily I'd won the tournament, so I could handle it. I wasn't homeless. But I did absolutely make a good living, playing 1-2, which you wouldn't think you could do. But I was averaging somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 a month, playing 1-2, 40 hours a week. And sounds excessive, and it was, but I was very overmatched for the field. Yeah, I was going to play some cash today with the mindset that if I lose, I'm paying for experience. You are. And I'll tell you, if you're doing it online, here's your best tool. Get a notepad, okay? After the hands are over, right? Like you play a hand and something happened that you don't understand, write down what you had, write down what the opponent had, write down what the flop and turn and river were, write down the action. I raised here, he did this. I checked here, he did that, whatever. Write it all down, and you can do two things. You can analyze it later, right? This is what I would do. I would write these down in these little papers, and then, after I was done with it, I would tear it off and throw it away, or I would tear it off and tape it to my monitor as a reminder, and then look, and when I saw the situation again, act correctly, and then I put a little check mark on the paper. And usually when I got to like 10 checks, I would be like, okay, I've got this spot down, and I would just throw the paper away just so my desk wouldn't get cluttered. But I did have notebooks that I would tape them in just so I could go back to them. And that's good experience that you can draw from live, and doing that exercise will allow you to understand how to learn at the poker table. People think playing poker is practice. It's not. You don't get better by playing. You get better by studying and by analyzing the hands you've played. So that's a good exercise for that. The other thing you can do with that information that you've written down is come back here on a Wake Up With Me and say, hey man, I got this hand. Can we go through it? And I'll say, sure. And then you'll say, okay, I raised pre-flop. Here was my cards. And you just tell me the action throughout the hand, one street at a time. And I'll give you my read on the scenario. And we can do it together. Why not? What else do I got to do, right? It's a really fun thing to do. And it gets us some, interaction on the stream, man. And I think, and it's good for me because I've learned how to explain what I'm doing more so through streaming, but also through talking to other players who don't study, because I want their perspective. Because the players that aren't as knowledgeable as me are the ones that I'm going to win the most money off of, but I can't forget what they're thinking. Because if I forget what they're thinking and I start thinking everybody thinks like me, I went through this about 2 years ago. I started gaining so much knowledge so quickly because I got a training site and started really honing in. I started leveling myself, going, well, obviously here he knows this because of that, and then if I do this, he knows. And I would scope myself out by saying everybody plays as knowledgeable as me. It's not true. It's not true. I realized it when I started losing and going, why am I losing here? But then I realized, holy shit, I'm giving the field too much credit. So I had to remember who I'm playing against. You know what I'm saying? And until I get to the higher buy-in, even at the higher buy-in levels, people do dumb shit. Like, people just don't study. Like, if you're studying, you're the low percentage of poker players out there in the field. Like, it's crazy. Some of the best players in the world, you might never know their name because they never showed up on TV, but it's amazing. Let's see here. All right, so let's do the quiz. I think we can finish up this section today, the pre-flop or the flop section with these examples. Under the gun +1 versus the big blind. Should you be betting frequently or infrequently on this board? Or you should be betting frequently. Yeah. We talked about it. You have the range advantage. Over 60% equity. Bet your entire range. I think that's what happened to me when I started watching you playing 2-L. Most of these people aren't playing proper. Right, they're not. So you can level yourself into thinking they know what you know. They don't. There's always something that they don't know. Use that to your advantage. Know that and draw up strength from that. When you're under the gun +1 versus the big blind on this board, which hand should use the larger bet size? Well, this is interesting. I would say the queen wants to use the larger bet size because there's more for the player to have, and since you have such a range advantage, there's not a lot for the jack to be up against, right? Like there's no draws here, so you can bet small or check very easily. Uh, Although when I see the both up here, a lot of these quizzes, the answer is both. But I'm just going to go with the queen. All right. You want to use top set, or you don't want to use top set as a big bet because it blocks your opponent from having top pairs. Right. When I have queens here, my opponent has a jack. He's going to pay me some money. He's not just going to fold it for one bet, right? On this board, you should check more often when out of position as the preflop raiser. Bang. Always true. You're out of position, you're always going to check more than if you were in position. You don't even need to read the rest of the question. You can say, oh, the board is ace, ace, ace. Out of position, you're going to check. Yes, I'm checking more. Out of position. Phil Ivey himself, in about 2008 at the World Series, somebody asked all these poker players how important is position. And they flashed through a bunch of them, right? And it was like Phil Hellmuth and Phil Locke and, David Benjamin and all these guys, like these amazing players, right? And they went to all of them and they gave them all like 45 seconds. And here's like Phil Hellmuth. Well, of course, position is supremely important because I have the advantage. I know what's going to happen, after all the action on the table. I have more information than my opponent, so of course I can act more correctly. And then it was Phil Locke. Well, position's great because when I have a great hand and the other guy doesn't know it, I get to let him bet first and I can trap and And David Benjamin, well, of course, position is amazing because then I get to play aggressive actions and my players have already given up the ghost on what they have and. You know what Phil Ivey said? My grandmother could beat me if I gave her position all day. And then he sat there for 30 seconds looking at the camera. And that sums it up. Anybody can beat anybody if they always have position on you. This is why, when you're out of position, play less hands. Okay? You're in the small blind, no calling range. Okay? If somebody raises, you're in the small blind, as a general rule, don't call. No matter what it is. Unless you have like a monster. Like if you have aces and you want to get the whole stack in, cool. You have kings, same deal. The only other calls that there are if there was a raise and a call and a call and a call, and the big blind is not likely to 3-bet jam, and you have something decent that you're getting good pot odds on. But that is so rare. Your pot odds have to be excessive. Okay? So there are very few calls from the small blind. What there are a lot of folds, but there are even more 3-bets. You can raise more from the small blind than you can call from the small blind. Your calling from the small blind should be a very small percentage, maybe 10%, and it's very situational. You know what I'm saying? It depends on what other action has happened at the table. But the same hand from the small blind would rather 3-bet. Like if you have pocket 9s from the small blind or even pocket 8s and the cutoff raises and the button folds and you're in the small blind, 3-bet. Why are you not 3-betting? Calling there does nothing. Only thing that calling there does is go, I hope I hit a set. And you just you just put the money in the pot and then you don't hit a set and you go, I didn't hit a set. And then you check and the guy bets and you fold and you just take it in the shitter your whole life. No. 3-bet. 3-bet. Now you've taken it away. No matter what now the guy calls you, if the board comes off fucking jack high like this, you can bet your entire range here of everything that 3-bet and win a large portion of the time. You take control away. I felt smart when my brother asked me why I folded a hand under the gun I played earlier as small blind. You should. Small blind's worst position on the table. It's so bad that it is a fact that every poker player alive loses from the small blind in full ring. It's a fact. No one is a winner from the small blind. If you look at the course of 10,000 hands for Fedor Holtz right now for the next 10,000 hands, he is going to lose from the small blind. The question is, how much do you lose? You know what I'm saying? If you lose less than your opponents do, you're a big winner. That's the concept. Position is supreme importance. And when I learned that fact, it was years ago. I started folding hands that were way too strong because I didn't know how to 3-bet from the small blind. I would fold pocket tens. If there was a raise and a call, believe it or not, I was like on a no call binge for like a year. This is like 8 or 9 years ago. I would just fold the tens. Just because I didn't know how to proceed. I knew I couldn't call. But the thought didn't enter my head that I could raise. Of course, it eventually came around. And I wasted a lot of hands, yeah. But at the time, it saved me money. It did make me money, but it saved me money. Because I would have played it improperly. So, food for thought. I think this is the last section. We're going to see how long it is.
Now let's discuss a neat scenario where the solver plays using an interesting strategy that maybe you should use against your opponents, maybe you should not. Let's discuss the low paired boards like Jack 6-6, Jack 5-5, Queen 5-5, 10-5-5, etc. So let's go through and categorize our range.
This is not Ace 5-5. The Jack is the highest. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about King 4. You know what I'm saying? We've already talked about that. The big high card being paired on a previous section yesterday. This is the low paired boards.
Naturally, right? Bet your best made hands. Notice I'm opting to slow play aces here. Bet your draws. Those are going to be all backdoor draws and king, queen for overcards. Check the marginal made hands, ace high and under pairs. And check the little bit of junk that you have, which are just these hands without a draw. Okay, fine. We categorized our range. Notice here, we don't have enough draws. We don't have enough junk, which means we have a very big range advantage. However, this is very important, we completely lack the nut advantage. So we should check very, very frequently because our opponent, in turn, should be check raising us a ton with like any backdoor flush draw, any backdoor straight draw, and a lot of sixes. Because this is that unique scenario where we have a big range advantage, but we lack the nut advantage.
Meaning we are most commonly starting with the best hand, but this board has most likely improved our opponent far more likely than us. We don't have hardly any sixes. We have some jacks. We have pocket jacks. We have ace jack. We don't always have king jack under the gun +1. We rarely have queen jack. You know what I'm saying? 10 jack, sure, but that's not great. You know what I'm saying? So when you have the range advantage on this flop, if you get action, you're kind of capped. You're kind of on one pair, and people are just going to go, oh, I hope this guy has aces because I can bluff him off that. Or I have a 6, and that's awesome. When your opponents want you to have aces, you are in a fucked scenario, okay? Because that means that they have a way to beat you, either by bluffing you. Because think about it, if you had aces here and you had raised pre-flop and under the gun +1, and the big blind had called, the flop comes off Jack 6-6. He checks, you bet, he calls, the turn comes off, it's a deuce. He checks, you bet, he raises. How do you like your aces now? Do they seem good? Or how about this? On that flop, you raised, big blind defended. The flop's Jack 6 or Jack 6-6. He checks, you bet, he check raises you. Again, how much do you like your aces? That's why you're check raising from the small blind here with all the draws. If this is Jack of spades, 6 of spades, 6 of hearts, and you have 2 spades in your hand, check raise. And then continue with aggression on the turn. Whether you hit the spade or not, just keep going. You know, there's the scene that always pops into my head. I relate to the world through movies mostly. The scene that pops into my head, if you remember the movie from the early 90s, Bloodsport with Jean-Claude Van Damme, there's a great scene where the guy who played Ogre in Revenge of the Nerds, he's Frank's, that's Jean-Claude Van Damme's character, he's his friend. He's the other American fighter who's in, I think they're in Taiwan, at the Kumite, right? And he's going up against the big guy, what's his name? Dompo. Or no, Dompo? Was that his name? I forget his name. Whatever it was, they would chant it, right? And it was played by Bolo Yan, who was the bad guy in Enter the Dragon, you know, the big buff Asian dude. His name's Bolo Yan. And everybody just knows him as Bolo. They actually used his real name in the movie. But anyway, he's the big bad. He's won the Kumite the last, 2 competitions. He's a killer. He's whatever. Well, Ogre, right? Frank's friend gets in the ring and immediately just bum rushes him, and he's just beating him down. He beats him down. He does the big 2-handed boom on the top of his head, and he just beats the shit out of him. And he turns around to the crowd when Bolo's on the ground, and it should be over, but he hasn't been knocked out, right? He hasn't been knocked out. He hasn't said mate, uncle, and he hasn't been killed. So the fight is still on, and Jackson, that's the guy's name, he turns around, looks at the crowd and goes, yeah, I got him, Frankie. I got him. And he looks at the crowd and he's like, Jackson. And then Bolo picks his head up, does the taste the blood thing and goes. And then he gets up and beats the fuck out of Jackson, puts him in the hospital, breaks his leg. It's a whole thing, right? And in that moment, Frank Dukes, Jean-Claude Van Damme's character, looks at Jackson and he's like, what are you doing? Don't stop. Keep going. And he's like screaming at him. And he's doing that. And that's what you want to do here. When you have the spades here, don't stop. What are you doing? Keep going. Check raise, bet the turn, bet the power through. You have to be aggressive and violent in these situations because you are trying to convince somebody to fold aces. You know what I'm saying? You're trying to scream at them, I have pocket sixes. Let's put all the money in, man. I got no problem. And when you check raise with the spades and the spade comes out and you bet huge, you would be amazed how many times people with pocket aces will sit there and go, this is bullshit. He's bluffing me. When now they even have more information. And when the turn comes off raggy, they're going to sit there and, if it's like a red deuce on a 2-spade flop and you check raise the spades and it's a red deuce and you bet huge again, they're going to go, fuck, this guy's got a 6, and they're going to throw it away. Because the spade coming out should scare you with a 6. It shouldn't, but they think it should. So what are you doing? Don't stop. Keep going. That's the thought that always enters my head. I can see Jean-Claude Van Damme in my head screaming it at Jackson. It's a really stark visual for me, and I keep it very close in my brain. And I haven't seen that movie in 10 years. It's really fucking a great scene, though, to drive this point home.
So make sure you pay attention to that very much. Notice here I actually recommend checking 56% of the time. And if you look at what the solver does, solver checks 59 to 60% of the time, right? Despite having a big equity advantage. And again, that's because we completely lack the nut advantage. I mean, notice the solver's just doing a lot of checking here. When it is betting, it's betting some low bluffs, right? It's betting whatever sixes it has, of course. Betting some of the jacks and then betting just a smattering of random hands to some extent. And I do want to make it clear that this is the GTO strategy, but if you're playing against someone who folds too often on the flop, that's not going to be check raising you with various backdoor draws and whatnot, then you should instead bet every single time with your entire range using a small size. Notice solver definitely uses a small size here. This is a scenario where when you lack the nut advantage and you are betting, you definitely want to bet small. So this is one of these weird corner cases where even though you have the range advantage, you should be betting using a small size. And as your opponent's going to play more weak and straightforward, you should bet more and more frequently, perhaps up to 100% of the time. Now, here we have another neat scenario where we have a lot of six.
Chong Li. That was the guy's name. Chong Li. I got to play it. I got to show you the scene.
When we work together, we get the job done. Thanks Susie Lee for working with both.
Hang on. I got to show you the scene. This is what goes on in my head when I'm afraid to bet. I swear to God, I see this on a daily basis. I see this.
Time to separate the men from the boys.
Just be careful, Chong Li doesn't separate your head from your body.
Go for the gut. It's tough there.
What the hell are you talking about?
Chong Li's weak in the gut. That's how Paradise surprised me. Hey, you listen to me? Go for the stomach and stay away from his right leg.
Will you stop worrying, Frankie? I've got it under control. You sound like my mother, man, alive.
I haven't seen this in 10 years.
Keep going.
That's the one that's in my head, I swear to God.
This is when we raise on the button and the big blind calls, but so does the big blind. They actually have more sixes than the player on the button, because the big blind is going to call with almost all the sixes, whereas the player on the button does not raise almost all the sixes. Notice the player on the button's lacking all of the junky 6x offsuit hands, right? Whereas the player in the big blind very easily could have those. So let's go through and categorize this to the best of our ability. We're going to call any reasonable jack and better a premium made hand. Marginal made hands are going to be roughly king high and better. You may say, is king high really a marginal hand here? It actually is. Very often you can let it go check on the turn. Or sorry, check on the flop, call a turn bet. And then we're going to call everything else a draw. All of these hands that have overcard and overcard to the 6. Not that that's all that relevant, but it does count for something. I don't think it's that big of a deal, really, which draws you use in this scenario, because, like I said, it doesn't really matter if you have 10-8 here or 10-4. They're all pretty bad. That said, it is important to note here that the junk will very likely change on the turn. When you let it go check on the flop, sometimes king high is going to get way worse. Sometimes ace high is going to get way worse. Notice that we've kind of mixed in categorizing some ace x as junk and some king x as junk. And like I said, this category down here, the marginal made to junk in this scenario is a little bit loose. What's most important, though, is that we really aren't betting all that often, only 16% of the time for value. And we want to mix in as many draws as we can, but there aren't a whole lot of obvious draws, because ace high and king high has showdown value. So we want to be betting queen highs because it has an overcard to the jack, and then just mix in as many junky draws as we can. We could, in theory, bet mostly with the backdoor draws. That would probably be a little bit better than just betting all of these. But I don't think it's that big of a deal, especially when we're just observing how we should be playing these hands. We just know we are betting with all the low showdown value hands to some extent. Notice here, again, we are checking 56% of the time. Solver opts to check even more, 68% of the time. So you see the solver checks here very frequently. It's even checking some sixes every once in a while, which is interesting. But as you see, solver just doesn't do a lot of betting. When the solver is bluffing, by the way, take a look at these hands that are that is choosing to bluff. It's a lot of, like, well, junky queen highs, right? And 10 highs. So a lot of the hands that I had selected as potential bluffs. And that's good to see, right? That we are selecting these low type hands to bluff. And solver does pick random, like 9-8 suited, right? Randomly betting a lot. Good luck figuring it out, right? 10-8 offsuit, randomly betting a lot. So you see the solver's picking some low equity bluffs to bet. And it's really not betting the ace highs and the king highs all that often at all, right? So you see some ace highs.
It's a big concept to get in, and this section kind of illuminated it for me about a year ago, where you need to have bluffs in your range that are just complete, utter trash. Like, people kind of get into this thing where your first bluffs that you make as a poker player are semi-bluffs. You know what I'm saying? Like, you make a raise, you pick up a draw, you have the king-queen suited, and you raise, and then you flop, the jack 10-4. And you didn't improve, but you lead, and, the player calls you, and then you bet again, and they call you, or whatever. You make your hand, you make a pair, something like that, and then or you go check on the river. But semi-bluffs, people feel much more comfortable bluffing because you have, the parachute, you have the escape hatch, to hit your hand and all like that. But stepping outside the box when you're knowledgeable, like when you get a lot more of experience and realizing range versus range, position, chips, place in the tournament, your stack, your opponent's perceived outlook on you and your perceived outlook on your opponent, all those kind of things, you can start mixing in just pure, unbelievably bare bluffs. because they make sense. And a range is just that. It's a range. It's good hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk. And there are many situations where you're going to bet all of those the exact same way. And by doing that, your opponent will never know if you have the nuts or nothing. And that means you're going to win all those pots with nothing as much as you are the pots with the nuts. So it makes up for when you don't get paid with the nuts, and it makes up for when you miss the flop with the junk. And you just make more money overall by having these stark nothing bets in your hand where it's like 10-8 offsuit here. Yes, you can bet. You know what I'm saying? But it's a very down-the-road concept. I'm not saying anybody should try it until they're very experienced and understand exactly why you're betting what you're betting. But studying sections like this will help you.
Betting, but not a lot of them. And the ones that are betting are usually the better ones. So anyway, I really wanted to point out this is a spot where you cannot just get away with betting every single time. Unless, of course, your opponent's weak and tight and straightforward, in which case it's still probably fine to bet small and frequently. Okay, now let's take a look at under the gun +1 versus button. Now we're in this interesting scenario again where now we don't lack the nut advantage because the player on the button doesn't have very many sixes in their range, and that's going to allow us to now bet slightly more frequently. We do still have to be a little bit careful.
Remember, that's because the big blind has all the sixes in his range, the button, not so many.
Although because the player on the button has a decent number of jacks. But go down, break down the range logically, and you see in this scenario we have 24% to 22% draw to premium made hand, and basically no junk. And I think this is reasonable.
To me, the most fascinating part on this one is the marginal made hands, the green spots, because you have all your ace highs, right, that will win in showdown a lot if it goes check all the way down, or maybe you call one bet on the turn and it goes check river. Also hands like jack 10. This is a check because it's the nuts. It's not because it's a marginal made hand, but it has to be put in a check column so it's green. Like the jack 10, you know what I'm saying? Like not being super, like if you raise with jack 10 under the gun +1 and the button called you, jack 10's not great, but it's definitely good. But you don't want to bet the flop. So if you check the flop and then the turn comes off like a 9 or something like that, if your opponent has anything, even ace high, and you bet the turn, they're going to call you. So you can then get two streets. You can bet the turn, and especially like if the river comes off a 9, like a double paired board, and he's got ace high, or even just like a 4 or something like that, you can usually get calls out of worse. So those are ones that you want to bet. You don't want to check the river because the ace high is never going to bet. You know what I'm saying? And when you bet and get raised, you just fucking fold. You know what I'm saying? Because there's literally nothing you can beat. But so jack 10 is the easy example, but 10s are also an easy example. 9s people think are worse. It's the same as 10s. 8s people think is worse, but it's the same as 10s. 7s, same deal. 6s is obviously the nuts. 5s is the same thing as 10s. It is a pair lower than a jack that wasn't improved by this board. That's it. Now, the 4s, 3s, and deuces aren't in your range because you're not raising that under the gun +1 at 40 big blinds. But you can see all these are bets, and they're reasonable bets. They're checks, because they're reasonable hands that have showdown value, but don't do well if you bet. So don't think these hands are worthless. This is the ace-high flop when you have kings. You know what I'm saying? It's a little different dynamic there, but we're generally talking about the same thing. And when I realized that and I expanded my range to checking and calling with these 10s, 9s, and 8s, started finding myself winning a lot more pots, and it just made no sense to me. But seeing this section, it did make sense because of the true value of my hand.
Maybe you want to check fold stuff like ace-7 without a backdoor flush draw. Like, sure, I guess. Same thing with like the low ace-x. You can just, without a backdoor flush draw, checking, that's fine. But checking and folding is fine. I mean, you have to be a little bit careful check calling ace-7 out of position with no backdoor draw against an aggressive opponent because they're going to barrel you off your hand almost all the time by the river. You may want to strengthen your checking range even a little bit more if you felt inclined, but I think this strategy is pretty nice. This has us checking half the time. Notice your solver checks 38% of the time, which is kind of close. Doing a lot of checking with some ace highs, right? A lot of ace highs check, some king highs check, under pairs check. So reasonable strategy, and I think this works out pretty nicely.
Marginal hand that will check but not fold to one bet. If you check the flop, your opponent checks the flop, and he bets the turn on that jack 6-6 deuce, let's say. If you have pocket 9s, if you check fold, you're a donkey. right? Just fucking call the bet, and then on the river, when he bets again, assess. Does he have a hand, or is he bluffing because you've shown weakness?
But this, I do want to point out that on this low paired board, if this is a spot where you very easily can get well out of line to exploit your tight, straightforward, passive opponents. But if your opponent's going to be check raising you very aggressively, you have to be cautious, especially whenever you're against the big blind, because they have a lot of sixes, and you, as the pre-flop raiser, do not.
Okay, so you're saying usually you get stuck when you 3-bet pre-flop and the flop is bad for you, like ace-king suited on a flop of a low rainbow. Okay, perfect example, right? So you're 3-betting, so I'm going to assume you're in a later position, right? So what are the ranges? What are the other positions? Let's give you an example. From early positions of under the gun... Choo-chee. Stop with the scratching. What are you doing? So let's say under the gun +1, or under the gun +1, and under the gun +2, which is the low jack 8-handed, raise. And you 3-bet from the button, right? Let's say. You have position, you've 3-bet, they've called you, you now have the range advantage. The low board comes out, right? The low rainbow flop. Who's more likely to have the overpair? You are. You are. Because a good... and we're not talking about this board. We're talking about a low, 7-4 deuce. Right. You're more likely to have the overpair. Because you 3-bet. So we talked about this. What do you do if you had an overpair in this scenario? Right? 7-4 deuce rainbow flop. You 3-bet pre-flop. You're going to go for value. So let's pretend you had a good overpair, not a monster like aces. Let's not make it too easy, but let's give you jacks. Okay, you could 3-bet that from the button, sure. From versus under the gun +1, or even under the gun. If they didn't 3-bet you, yes, sometimes they are going to be trapping you with aces, but you're going to find that out very quickly. So the flop, the opponent checks to you. You're going to bet. Your bet here should be for value. You're going to bet 2/3 pot, maybe slightly under that. So they raise to 2.5, right? Let's do all the math, right? I'm going to show you all the math, how it's going to play out. Okay, you're at 40 big blinds. They raise to 2.5, right? There's the small blind, big blind, and the ante in the pot, which is another 2.5, right? Oh, so sorry. So it's 2.5 plus the small blind, big blind, and ante, another 2.5 plus your raise. Now you're going to raise properly, so you're going to make it on the button. You don't have to make it as big as if you weren't on the button, because you have position on the blinds should they decide to call, so they're less incentivized to call. So your raise is going to be about to 7, let's say, right? So you make it 7. That's 12 blinds, and your opponent calls. He calls the additional, what is that, 4.5, right? Or, yeah. So he calls, so 4.5. So you've got 16.5 in the pot, okay? And you have 33 blinds behind. And you have pocket jacks, right? This is what your range represents. Jacks, tens, queens, kings, aces. So in this board, you're going to bet 2/3 of the pot, right? And you can round out, you know what I'm saying? Like, just use the 3/4 pot bet button and then just scale it back a little bit. You always see me doing that because they don't have a 2/3 pot bet. So my bet here is going to be somewhere, 1/3 of this pot is approximately 5. So 2/3 is 10. You go a little bit more. You know what I'm saying? So what are you going to bet here? You're going to bet like 11. Okay? If you had jacks in this scenario, you would bet like 10 or 11. Maybe on the button, I would probably bet 10. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm so strong with my position. If my opponent calls me, then I have to assess what's going on. If the turn, if it takes a long time for him to call or whatever, maybe that gives up some information, things like that. But at that point, I've now put 17 blinds into the pot, and I have 23 blinds behind, right? So, if I had jacks, and my opponent had called that flop, and the turn comes off, and the board is 7-4 deuce, and the turn comes off another deuce, and he calls that flop, right? Now he checks the turn. Even if I had jacks here, a lot of players who aren't completely thinking players are going to check back. We're now representing the field. So I'll check back. And on the river, my opponent is going to check a large portion of the time. When they check, we have one move with jacks, which would be to go all in. Because maybe they called a bet on the flop with ace king, they missed, now we're betting to hopefully get called by ace high, but nobody's going to do that, so they're going to fold. Right? You have ace king. If you played the hand the same exact way, where's the danger? Show me the danger. You 3-bet with ace king on the button, same exact way, same exact betting, right? You check the turn because you're pot controlling. Also, it's very easy for you to get all the money in the pot, right? If that was your goal with pocket kings, let's say, right? It'd be very easy for you to get all your money into the pot with this betting structure. And your opponent may just make the call to continue on the flop to maybe see you bet again, okay? Now, depending on the player, if the player is a loose actiony kind of overly aggressive player, he may bet on the turn, right? And if somebody bets on the turn there with ace king, I'm probably jamming on them, because unless they jammed all in on me, they are probably blocker betting me, which means they have something worse than my ace king. Believe it or not, ace king then becomes the nuts. Now, are you going to get traps? Now, it depends on the strength of your hand, obviously. I think queens is a good line to take with this, but it also works with tens, right? So when you bet the flop for 2/3 pot and you get called, it kind of depends what you know about your opponent. It doesn't depend what you know about the deck. Don't sit there going, there's aces, kings, and queens and jacks in the deck that beat my pocket tens. It means, wait a minute, what do I know about my opponent? How would he play them? Now, if the stakes you're playing is specifically, I would say any buy-in at $10 or less in a tournament, players are not going to be this competent or patient with overpairs. They are going to freak out. So when you 3-bet preflop and the guy has aces, kings, queens, he's just going to jam for the 40 big blinds. If that's the case, you call it with the ace, king. 40 big blinds is fine. You know what I'm saying? Because he's going to also jam jacks. He's going to jam queens. He's going to jam tens. He's going to jam ace, queen suited, ace, jack suited. All these hands that you have great equity against, so you'll just call it. But when they just call your 3-bet out of position, you're going to be finding that a lot of players are going to do this with any pair, any two big cards, you know, ace, jack, and better, you know, things like that. So then when you bet the flop, they just fold. They just fold. You have to think about betting range, not just your hand. Yeah, here's the way that it works. Okay, position. Position, which is tied to range. Stack, cards. That's the order. So it's like position, which we're going to include with range, because your range is defined. What your range is defined by your positional action. So those two are kind of the same. So position, stack, cards. 3 things. Your cards matter least. If you keep this in mind, your exact hand matters least. Your range is what matters more. And people know this. You know what I'm saying? Range is very common now. Players didn't used to think this way. Good players did. Bad players didn't. They would just go, well, I got pocket tens and I don't think you got nothing. And then you would just show them the fucking jacks every day of the week. And it's crazy because a lot of times in that situation, when I've 3-bet those queens on the button, I bet the flop. People go, he's got ace king, and they jam all in with 9s on that 7-high flop. And you go, call. And you just, because nobody's patient enough to do that with aces and kings. And now that you know that, you do it with aces and kings. When you have aces under the gun +1 and you raise and the button 3-bets you, don't 4-bet. Right? If you have 40 big blinds, your goal is to get the money in, it's going to be easy to do. Just call. And then when the flop comes off, and it's going to be innocuous most of the time, unless it's just a monotone board that you don't have one of those suits of, you don't have to freak out. On a regular board, on average, like even if it's a king high board, because the guy's going to have ace king, or a queen high board, that's fine. If the player decides to bet again, just let your time run, and then call, and then check the turn. And you're going to be amazed how many times people are just going to blast off in your face, and you're just going to call them and show them the aces. and they're not even going to have a pair. And also people have hands like queens, jacks, kings, tens on a 7 high flop because they're going to freak out. They're not going to understand what's going on. People don't think ahead. So understanding the strength of your range should have you betting based on it. Basically, range is like, oh, I can have this, 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 and this. I can have all these hands. This board either improves or is not affected by all these hands. So therefore, I am going to bet. My hand should still be best if it's in this range. Just make sure you know your ranges properly based on your position. And plus, that's a nice scenario for when you have like king, queen on the button and under the gun raises and he's been raising a little bit too much. Maybe the player's a little too loose. You have king, queen on the button. You 3-bet and he calls. You have now removed so many combinations of kings, queens, ace, king, and ace, queen out of his range that when the board comes off and the guy checks to you on most boards versus a player like that, you can just bet. You can just bet. And they have to fold because they don't have enough hands that can continue, but they like playing too many hands. That's why the HUD is important. It tells you how many hands they're playing, how many hands they're raising, how often they fold to a 3-bet. If I see a player who's playing 30% of hands and playing 20% of them for a raise and never folding to 3-bets, I am 3-betting him at every opportunity in position that I can. I don't give a fuck what my cards are. I'm doing it because I know I'm getting called, right? And I'm not going to adjust the size of my 3-bets. I'm not going to go smaller or bigger because he calls every time. I'm going to go the same way, right? My method is GTO. I'm going the same way. Then he calls, the flop comes off, and he checks, and 80% of the time when I bet, I'm going to win the pot. You actually want him calling pre-flop because he's going to miss this board about 65% of the time. And when you have hands with good blockers and removal, like the Broadway cards and stuff like that, and you're just betting blindly on every board, because you're up against a player like that. You have to understand what your range means and the opponent's methodology, what they're thinking. And the truth of the matter is most opponents are not thinking. If you're thinking, you're going to do better. So that's how you consider range in your mind. But it's position, stack, cards. Those are the 3 things. And like I said, range is tied to position. Position, stack, cards. Cards matter least. Except in a showdown. That's it. Okay. Under the gun +1 versus the big blind. Should you bet frequently or infrequently on this board? Infrequently, because he has the nut advantage. We have the range advantage, which is great, but in the real world, he has more 6s and more jacks. True, I have to think a lot about betting range, not just my hand. Thanks, it helps a lot. Good, man. I'm glad. I'm glad that it helps, man. And I'm hammering this home because these are lessons that took me a long time, and when I realized them, I went, the fuck am I doing? Like, it seems so obvious once you get the concept. On this board, you should bet more frequently when you're in position or out of position as the pre-flop raiser. Well, oh, wait a minute. Out of position. Oh, it's because we have the nut advantage. I'm sorry. I clicked that wrong. Out of position is one of the most unique spots when you're out of position because this position caller does not have many 6x combinations in the range, so you get to bet more. Right. So out of position, if you just call to raise, you're going to have more 6s than the in position player. So you're going to bet more. So that's the check raise. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're going to check, you're going to raise, or you're going to lead out on that flop a lot more into the raiser. On this board, you should be betting more often when you're on the button versus the big blind. Okay, when you're on the button versus the big blind. So you're on the button versus the big blind. Should you bet more there, or should you bet more under the gun versus the big blind? You should be betting more often when you're on the button because you have position in both, but your range on the button is wider, so you're going to have more 6s than you are when you're under the gun. See what I'm saying? So yeah. What? See, this is I'm talking about nut advantage. It's talking about range advantage. Oh, I fucked up. Word problems are hard for me. On Jack 6-6, you should be betting more often when you're on the button versus the big blind, or when you're under the gun versus the big blind. Okay. So you're not going to bet very often because the big blind has the nut advantage, but you are going to bet when you have the range advantage more often than when you don't. And that is when you're under the gun versus the big blind, because you're going to have more aces, kings, queens. Okay, I understand what it's saying now. I read that too quickly. I got to slow down on these because they're very complicated questions. So it's saying we're not going to bet often, but when we bet, which position are we going to bet more from? And it's under the gun +1 because we have aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, jacks, tens, all in our range. Whereas on the button, we have those hands far less because our range is wider. It contains more hands. So we have more of a nut advantage, but still not the nut advantage. But we have a more conceivable scenario where we will have a 6 than when we're under the gun. Okay, cool. Mark is complete. I believe that finishes this section. If it doesn't, then I'm going to have to call it here. Yeah. Okay, so this is as the preflop aggressor with a range advantage on the flop. That's all we were talking about. So we're going to mark that as complete. And the next section will be as the preflop aggressor without the range advantage. So this is like 3-betting from the small blind, or you raise and you're under the gun and anybody else at the table plays. So you have the range advantage. You don't have the range advantage. So like you're the preflop aggressor, you 3-bet in the cutoff and versus the under the gun player, and he calls. So you don't have the range advantage. All right, that's cool. All right, cool. So we're gonna pick that up tomorrow. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna play today. I think mostly it's gonna be cash, but I'm gonna look over the tournaments. I just have a lot of stuff to do today, and I want to do some editing off and on. So I'm probably gonna stream 2 or 3 times today and just play cash on WSOP, just because I'm kind of feeling that right now. But yeah, and tomorrow's going to be a tournament day for sure. So you guys will see me again later, most likely. If not, just be aware of the fact that I'm making the next Jedi mind trick, and you will all get some new content. So I'll see you guys soon. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate you staying and keeping me company, and hope you got a lot out of this, because I did. Rewatch these. They're all going to be uploaded on the YouTube, the main channel, !YouTube, under the Wake Up With Me section, and you'll see it with the current thumbnail, which is, oh, not that one. That's before I altered it. It's this one. So this is the current thumbnail for this specific section, is me as Yoda meditating. All right, guys. I will see you later. Have a good day. Talk to you in a while.